Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of Activist Lawyer. Jack's in the studio with me.
Hello everyone.
On this fine, summery, mizzly day in Newry. And I am delighted to be joined by David Renton via Zoom. Hi David.
Hello, lovely to see you. I'm in London where it's a bit brighter and sunnier, I guess.
It's always
warmer,
brighter
yeah.
in London, isn't it? Oh, well, great to have you here. So just by way of introduction, David has been a barrister at Garden Court Chambers since 2010 and has represented clients in some of the leading employment and housing cases of the past decade. His cases have been at the cutting edge of trade union law, anti-union discrimination and the protection of free speech. David was a visiting professor in sociology at Johannesburg University and for several years a national equality official of the University and Colleges Union. David's the author of more than 20 books in history, social and legal theory, which have been translated into a dozen different languages. He's now working on a project which addresses why the law has come to absorb areas of political controversy, how projects to roll back the expansion of the law can end up entrenching class and social power, and whether social movements should work with or against the law. He also writes regularly for The Guardian and London Review of Books, and also has a book just out recently, which we're going to get into throughout this podcast. But before we get into the nitty gritty of things, and I think there's a lot there to get through and very, very thematic and relevant. David, you might just give us a little bit of a background about yourself and your journey into law and your career so far.
Well, listen, thanks so much, Sharon. It's a real pleasure to be on here. In terms of my background, it's kind of simple. I never wanted to be a lawyer. I got past the age of 30 before I had any legal qualifications at all. I came to it through a kind of different route, which was essentially I completed my undergraduate. I went straight into a PhD. I went straight from there to teaching in universities. I think I was like 25 in a university in northwest England. In my first sort of full-time job, and I went along to the union meeting, and the hat goes around, who's going to be the branch secretary for the union this year? And to my foolishness, well, it can't be a bad thing to do, can it? Surely, put myself forward. I was then just a branch secretary for my trade union for a couple of years. At the end of it, we went through several rounds of redundancies. The last round of redundancy was one redundancy, and that was me. So that was quite an experience. And then I came from that to working for the union, UCU, the Lecturers Union, which I was doing full time by maybe I was 27, 28. And then I did that for 3 or 4 years. And then it just seemed obvious to me that I loved what the union was doing. I wanted the union to win. But in practice, all the things which mattered to us, like, I don't know, the issue of lots of lecturers being on very short-term contracts and much worse paid, and that predominantly affecting women lecturers. That was a huge strategic issue for us, and we had no plans whatsoever to defeat it, except through litigation. So it just became really, really clear that if I wanted to change the law, what the union was actually hoping people would do was go off, provide the skills, learn how to do it, and then try and fight here. So that's basically why I moved up.
Oh, wow. And in terms of then, I mean, you're not just representing clients and being involved in quite high profile cases that maybe we'll discuss if we can. But in terms of, I guess a lot of your work there is very unique in terms of research, and you're widely published as well. We might just start off with talking about your recent publication, if you want to let us know a little bit about that, Against the Law.
Yeah, sure. Essentially, when you read out my biography, it spoke at the end that the last few sentences talking about the project I was involved in. Well, this is the project. It's a book just trying to ask, I think, some quite big questions about how do we use the law, what's the right amount of law from the point of view of social movements. Obviously, a lot of the stuff I had in my head when I was writing it was the government's current attack on people using the law to shield against what feels like the government becoming slowly more authoritarian. And, it's not just in Britain, seeing the same things in France, in America, in Hungary, in lots of different places. So people are using the law as a response. Now, what the government says back is, aha, that's terrible. There's all these activists doing these political interventions in the law. And, the government's had some success, I think, in terms of persuading the senior judiciary. This isn't how the law should be used.
Sure.
But really, I suppose what I'm saying is, is it actually true that campaigns are using the law more than they used to? Probably it is true. And is this, let aside whatever the government's saying about it, just purely from our perspective, is this actually what we should be doing? And should we try and think about other forms of social power which might get us the victories we want, including maybe even legal victories? Maybe sometimes you get those actually through protest outside rather than necessarily just through litigation.
Sure. And one of the themes there that I did mention, which really stands out to me, is whether social movements should work with or against the law. And we slightly covered this a little bit with previous guests that I are perhaps following a similar route to yourself and would have had a lot of association with grassroots movements and the trade unions, leading them to a career in law. But I mean, what's the answer to that? Or is that something that you're still working on in terms of research? How important is it for social movements to affect change through law?
Well, I think part of the answer has got to be specific. Yeah? There are certain groups of people who realistically, they're never going to have an enormous amount of social power, even if they organise collectively. And practice law might well be the best they can do. Yeah? So I'm not by any means saying everyone now give up on law immediately.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that for larger social movements, I'm saying things which do have that social power, you don't need to litigate, or you don't need to treat litigation central. And if I just go this is just purely an anecdote, yeah? Just one example. There are lots of stories in the book which are more developed than this, which is one that occurred to me while you were asking the question. Between about 10 and 5 years ago, I was effectively in-house counsel to a protest movement called the Blacklist Support Group. And they were a group of blacklisted construction workers who had been spied on by a private organisation called the Consulting Association. It had gathered the names of trade unionists and had given them to employers so that people wouldn't get a job. And the blacklist had been secret, so people didn't know that their names were on the blacklist. And then eventually they did, and eventually they tried to sue about it. And I think of the 51 cases, maybe one succeeded. And I did a number of the cases for them, and 48 lost. I mean, I think, of the 2 or 3 that stayed in the system longest, I had 2 of the 3 that stayed longest, but, overall we lost. But one of the cases I really remember doing was on Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth line, which just opened in London and had loads of fanfare. So it's opened this year. And it's about this electrician called Frank. And we were absolutely convinced he'd been blacklisted. And his wasn't historic blasting. This was going on right now. We knew it because the subcontracting site admitted it was going on. Despite that, when we went to court, it was impossible. Everything the employers argued, they won. It didn't matter which barristers we had in court. We just lost and lost and lost. And eventually the case got dismissed. And it was just going nowhere. About 3 months later, the employer rings up and says, we're willing to settle. We're going, well, why are you even offering to settle if you won? And so we'll give them the job back and we'll give a sum of money. But let's say it was a large enough sum of money that my chin dropped and hit the table. It's how on earth have they done? They've already won the case. Yeah. Why on earth did they want to settle? And the truth was they weren't remotely interested in settling the case. What they were interested in was settling these bloody blacklisted workers, electricians and similar, who were going along to meetings of the employer's body, standing outside huge inflatable plastic rats, saying, you building bosses are absolute rogues. What you've done with blacklisting is absolutely offensive. And that's what they wanted to settle. They used the fact we had this dormant case just a way of making peace with the social movement. And sometimes in life, actually, protests, involvement on the streets, turning out the numbers, those sorts of things, what trade unions call leverage, is actually far more effective at getting a result for the person you're representing than thinking, we'll go along and we'll do it all in court.
Okay. And currently, how do you see that working at the moment? I know at the time of recording this will go out a bit later, but we are still looking at the state of affairs in the UK with strikes in terms of workers, real workers, and the whole concept of trade unions has come alive again. But it seems to me that the meaning behind what they're doing, strikes, pickets, etc., is almost lost, and it's almost as though it's part of a bygone era. Even when the media are covering it, they don't seem to understand the purpose or point. And I know that's why we have people now like Mick Lynch, for example, who's become quite well known, an icon over the last few weeks, but having to explain trade union law, employment law, and its effectiveness and what this actually means, because it just seems to people that this is so alien that we have to, have workers strike. So what's happening now? What's in terms of just across the UK, how is this playing out at the moment in terms of, your work on trade union law, and how do we get to this stage and what can be done about it? And, does it seem alien in this day and age to have these strikes?
Well, you're definitely right. I mean, if you look at the figures in history, I don't have them to hand, but it's something like between 1889 and 1989, the average number of strikes every year in Britain is about 2 million per year. Mm-hmm. And since that time until the last couple of years, I think it's never been much above 100,000. Mm-hmm. So strikes, and volume of strikes has fallen by, 19/20th. So that's 95%. Mm-hmm. And that I'm not talking just Britain now compared to big strikes. I'm talking about Britain compared to the entire 100 years beforehand.
Sure. Quiet
days, quiet years, exciting years, whatever. We're still 95% down on all of that. So trade unions are recovering from an incredibly low base. But again, this isn't really a legal answer, but I think one of the reasons why it feels like trade unions have suddenly become much more central to people again is, remember, we're in a high inflation economy.
Yeah.
And so the things which people are having to consider in their workplace is, how do you protect your wages? If inflation's going up by 10%, if gas and electricity prices going up by more than that, actually there's very few legal mechanisms by which you can keep your wages up. Almost inevitably, you have to start considering things like strike action or forms of collective protest like that, because there's no court that's going to turn around and give you a 10% pay rise you need just to keep your pay in real terms where it was at. Mm-hmm. Now, that's different from what unions have been trying to do for most of the last 40 years, which isn't to try and increase wages, but just to stop people being sacked. If you want to stop people being sacked, there's very widely developed legal remedies, unfair dismissal, and you can bring that to the courts. So I think one of the reasons why it changed, I appreciate this isn't really something that everyone talks about, but I think it's literally the things unions have been trying to do for the last 30 or 40 years. It's felt to people like the only way of getting them was by going to court. Mm-hmm. Whereas right now, the things people need to do, actually, it's almost impossible to get that from court. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of why we're seeing that seeming rebirth of trade union activism. It's not just about the RMT. I mean, we made a list of all the people on strike this year. It's junior doctors, it's post, it's barristers. It's all sorts of
yeah. So we're in really testing times, and of course all of this comes in the back of the B word, Brexit. And I know you couldn't have written a book against the law without mentioning that, and the rise of populism in the UK. But as we mentioned just before recording, that's across the board, France, and I mean we've seen how the rise in right wing kind of politics has been documented. And this word has been used by yourself as well, that this exploits a certain kind of a promise of de-juridification. For example, this whole concept of taking back control, and you mention as well about the anti-protest laws. I mean, we've spoken about here the government's attempt to stop judicial review as a legal mechanism. I mean, it's quite a worrying time in history, isn't it, for lawyers and I suppose people who need access to justice?
Well, it definitely. But I also think that sort of resisting that and kind of responding to it in a way which turns things around, I think a lot of it starts from just trying to understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. If at least you know what's going on, then what your campaigns might be more effective, I'd hope. You talked about the slogan "Take Back Control," and I think you're right that it was the central slogan of Brexit. And one of the things I try and do in the book is try and just think quite slowly and carefully about what that really meant. Mm-hmm. Because people just try and say, "Oh, it's just nonsense. It's what politicians say," and ignore it. So I don't think you understand why Brexit, which was initially the minority cause. It had all sorts of people against it, had the government against it effectively. Yeah. So in terms of winning the referendum, there must have been some chord they struck with ordinary voters. Just try and work thinking what that was. And I think if you listen carefully to that slogan, take back control, what it's really saying to people is, in your life, more and more decisions are taken out of your hand, and they're taken into this realm of experts in the law, which you've got no control over whatsoever. Some of those experts, or some of those people who have all this control, which you need to bring back. The problem with them is they're abroad, and because they're abroad, you can't influence them. Mm-hmm. Even if you elect your own politicians, because they're only like one set of politicians in the 40 countries in Europe, they can't influence it either. So the idea was that by taking back control, in fact, it was take back certain laws, principally laws around workplace, laws around environment, bring them back so they're controlled by domestic politicians, and you elect them so you have control of them and they have control of the law. Mm-hmm. Now, some things I'm saying in the book, I suppose, is that although it's horrible to see the right use ideas like that and completely cynical, there's been no decrease to the law. There's no sense in which people have more control in their lives than they did 5 or 10 years ago. So we can say that's cynical and opportunist and whatever. But it is worth maybe saying that this idea that the law and bureaucracy, etc., feel alien to people, feel them don't control. Maybe that is actually how lots of people experience in life. A lot of questions I kind of ask, and they're questions about the law, is, do you know what's in your employment contract? Yeah. Do you know what rights aren't in your employment contract that you can enforce? Do you know what's in your tenancy agreement? Do you know what's in your mortgage agreement? Last time you were online and you had a box come up saying, do you agree to the terms and conditions? Did you read them? If you had read them, could you have understood them? Do you think you could have? And there's this sense in all of our lives that, like, actually we are getting out of control. Mm. So if we could turn that instinct back and use it as a way of people having more control in their lives, that would actually be much better all around.
Absolutely, and I guess that's probably addressed in your book.
And one of the main questions that your book sought to answer was why we need fewer laws. So if you can even do it in brief
fewer
terms,
laws.
Yeah. If you can explain it to the listeners and us as well, do we need fewer laws in the UK?
Yeah, sure. Look. There's 2 points here. When I talk about fewer laws, some of what I'm saying is just simple laws. And some of what I'm saying is there's certain areas of life which the law, actually people could do better if the law was slightly pulled away from. Mm. So if I take those two separately, that's right, just firstly fewer laws, yeah? One of the things which makes it really difficult to understand life, employment, housing, immigration, benefits, anything, is just the complexity of the systems that we deal with. I'm a housing lawyer. If I have to list to you all the number of different kinds of tenancies the person could be living in, secure tenancies, introductory tenancies, demoted tenancies, property guardianship tenancies, student tenancies, asylum seeker tenancies, honestly, if I listed all of them, it'd take me about 3 minutes. So when someone comes across my door and knocks on the door and says, right, I've got a possession order made against me, do I have to leave my home? Very, very often for me, it's something which I need to think about for 2 or 3 hours to get the answer. Mm. And it's also the same for judges too. One of the things that I've quite noticed is lots of judges complaining, loathing immigration laws. It's horrible complexity.
We hear it.
Yeah. And the truth is, number one, just if laws were simpler, we'd all understand them better. So if say a politician is saying, all right, I want to increase the minimum wage, or I want to, whatever the proposal is, we would know exactly what it meant. We'd know much better what it meant if the laws were simpler and easier to understand. So the first thing I'm saying, even if you don't change anything else about the law, just make it simpler and easier for people to understand. But the second thing I'm saying is that there are areas of life where if you could pull the law out to some extent, actually maybe people who don't have a lot of power and don't have a lot of whatever would actually have a stronger bargaining power. And that can't be something you do from above. To some extent, they have to do it themselves. But the obvious example is and it's something we've already been going at through this interview a bit, is employment law. Now, if you go back 50, 60 years to that epoch in British history where unions were a lot stronger, the practical reality is that unions, workers and trade unions had, relatively compared to now, much higher incomes as a percentage of total income. And they were much more likely to stay in their jobs if their employers tried to sack them. We can get some stats from this. You can look at when people were sacked in the 60s and they complained and they asked the employer for their job back. And everything we can tell is essentially, they asked for their job back, essentially about a third of the time they got their job back. Right now, if you want to go to the employment tribunal, if you bring your case for unfair dismissal, if you win, essentially, 1 in 1,000 unfair dismissal claims that makes it to a final hearing ends in order for reinstatement or re-engagement. So juridifying the idea of making all these things subject to the law hasn't done what it was supposed to do. It hasn't led to people actually getting a better chance in their job. It's led to a much worse chance. Now, obviously, I'm not just talking about employment. I'm saying that similar approach might apply to quite a lot of other social movements. It might apply to housing.
Well, it definitely applies to immigration when you think about it. The complexity of the immigration rules, it goes for a number of reviews, appeals, and essentially the person ends up normally staying here anyway, because it's unlikely that they'll be deported or removed. You know, the figures will speak to that. So it's their lawyers, any people representing them go through a huge kind of process of complex rules involving perhaps 2 judges, and in the end they're protected anyway.
Yeah, it's contradictory to its purpose, really.
But one of your former guests wrote something on his free movement of Colin Yo just in the last couple of weeks, and I read it, and it was just brilliant, because I read it, but I don't do immigration law. Sometimes I do, say, employment or housing cases with a bit of immigration law in it, but I'm not an immigration lawyer. But he wrote this thing, and it took my breath away, because it just explained so much. He said, if you look at what's actually happening in terms of decisions, right now, 80 or 90% of people who apply for refugee status essentially end up getting leave to remain, either through an initial decision or through an appeal. But we still have a legal system that's based on, like, the press rhetoric of the early 90s about bogus asylum. So you've got to deal with all this imagined possibility of false claims. And there's a vast construction of a whole legal apparatus to stop something that isn't actually a social problem at all. And as a non-immigration lawyer, I went, okay, right, that's really smart. Now I understand what you guys are dealing with.
It's incredibly frustrating. It's actually shocking, even for us, that we're used to it and we know what to expect. But I worked between the 2 jurisdictions, Ireland and the UK. And I have to say the difference is stark in terms of the complexity of rules. I'm not even going to say laws, but rules and policies that change weekly that we have to keep up with, compared to in Ireland, where a lot of it is policy based and enshrined in legislation that's been interpreted, by the courts over time. But yes, de jurification of the law in immigration.
It's called shrinking the law. Shrinking the law is perfectly fine.
It would be very much welcome in immigration, along with everything else. But that's so interesting. And I mean, as you're right, it can cover any aspects of society. And I guess I suppose it's not something, I mean, you've just brought it up quite, and you're a barrister, you're not necessarily specialising in criminal law, but just in terms of, it's quite shocking when people who don't work in law and have a preconception that barristers are so highly paid, to hear that junior barristers in the UK are earning less than £12,000 a year in many cases. Now, I know that's not your area either, but I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that and the strikes, and, are they going to get anywhere with this, do you think? Well,
I really hope they are, because, I mean, again, it's kind of interesting, because if you put 100 barristers in a room and you say to them, here's an issue, solve it, the first thing all barristers will do, that 100 people do, suddenly you'll get 85 clever ideas for how you can take it to court. Could you run this as a judicial review? How about if we do this? And what's really striking, I'm not a criminal barrister, so obviously I've got criminal barristers in my chain, as lots of friends are, but I'm not. But the thing that I find really fascinating about them is that they haven't been looking for a super smart legal remedy, even though that's what they're all good at. They said no, what they need to do is actually try and treat it like an industrial issue and reduce their labour, and that's how they'll have the most amount of power. As for whether they'll win, I don't know. And look, I really hope they do. I'm a civil legal aid barrister and I do housing law, and we get paid an hourly rate of about £60 an hour, which hasn't gone up since 1981. It's not just it hasn't gone up, it's actually 50% of what it was in 1981. So, no, I'm not talking about real, I'm talking about actual. We've had a 50% actual pay cut, we've had no pay rise in 40 years. So it would be great for us if they could change what happens with civil legal aid too. And it's very hard to organise civil legal aid barristers, much harder than criminal legal aid barristers. We don't have the option of all being together collectively. But I mean, the only other thing to say is that there really is something extraordinary going on in the criminal court. I'm not enough of an insider to say a lot about it, but essentially the idea that we've accepted this backlog in the criminal law system where cases, the average time to get a case trial now, as I understand, is about 18 months, and sometimes it's much, much longer. Basically, barristers saying, we're fed up with all the cuts, we're fed up with the cuts of defense, we're even fed up with the cuts of the prosecution, frankly. And you have to stop that one. And you cannot have a justice system where even from the point of view of thinking about the people who are the witnesses to a crime or the victims of a crime, if you turn around to them and say, you go along to the police and it may be 2-3 years later and you're still waiting for court date, that's just, as a society, that's just wrong. That all those different cuts have to be reversed. The one that they've got the power to change is the one which they're going at. But what I do think, all my senses are, is the government doesn't like that movement and is slightly inclined to try and see if it can deal with it because they don't like that message getting out into the public. There's a reason why criminals are walking around free, and it's your incompetence, it's your false penny pinching, it's your prioritisation of the wrong things, and they don't want that message to get out.
It's not the activist lawyers and the lefty lawyers.
I know, I'm surprised that hasn't been been put out in the media yet. But David, obviously when you spoke there about the beginning of your career and how you didn't have a legal qualification until you were 30, I think a lot of people these days will be maybe coming into university quite late. Would you have any tips or advice for anybody coming into the law later in life, if you got any advice for them?
I don't think I can say anything much more than, believe in yourself and understand that actually, as barrister chambers, I very often do the recruitment for our chambers. And we are looking for people at any stage of life, and we want people with experience. And we know that the relevant experience may well not be in the law. I'll try and explain why, and I'll try and give some examples. First of all, just why, someone might have the most brilliant academics, and they might have gone through university at some quadruple quick speed. But to survive as a lawyer, you have to have skills in terms of dealing with really stressful, intense situations. And very often there isn't that much you can do through the law, but there's an awful lot you can do by listening patiently, taking the extra care to really try and understand, and sometimes just being a shoulder that people can cry on a bit. Often if you want your client to win, often if you want your client to exit a case with dignity, and both of those can be good results, you need that extra heft which comes with having been around a bit longer. And it is extraordinary the people who want to apply to become barristers. I look at people's applications. We get them changed. We've got 6 places and we get 600 or 700 people apply each year. And it's really brutal as you go through whittling it down. But I can tell you about some of the people we put through to interviews. We put through, which is one story, we're a very lefty chamber. If we do represent people who've been in wars, for example, probably they're the victims of torture or killing at the hands of the state. We probably aren't going to be for the state in that situation. But I remember the last one recruitment round, we had someone come in, they put in their CV, and their CV said that she had been commander of a frigate in the British Navy, and she'd had something like 400 people working under her command. And then she'd gone off and done a law degree, and she was only like midway through the conversion class. I was like, yeah, of course we could interview her. Because so much of the job actually, is about, can you deal with those sorts of tough situations?
Sure.
And being able to pull out the right case helps, but it's not the only thing that can get you through that situation.
And just in today's discussion, it's so interesting to hear you talk about maybe turning some of the negative attempts by the government to, change. I mean, anti-protest laws was one thing that we mentioned, but there's a chain of attempts that they've done over the course of the last few years to turn that on its head and maybe, you know, take ownership of that and use it in our advantage as lawyers, but also for our clients. But on that note, I guess our question that we ask all of our guests is about activism and using the law, you know, to make effective change, which you have touched on. And it's been really fitting that you are here today in this podcast, because it's actually what, you know, we set out to do initially. Yeah. But just as final thoughts, I guess, for our listeners, I mean, how effective is activism in the law? And I mean, you know, how do we use it to our best advantage?
Okay, well, first of all, is just to get the sense that it's there, yeah? Mm-hmm. And it's there and often in surprising places. You know, when I started off as a barrister, I used to go down to court in East London, and there was a housing judge, and I knew a bit about his background for whatever reason, through mutual friends of lawyers. And, you know, I knew that, for example, that she called her sons who were, you know, about to leave school, she called them when they're young, she called them Fidel and Che. You know, so the activist lawyer, who you might think of this sort of 20-year-old radical, they might also be someone who's 30, who's 40, who's now in a different place in the legal system. That happens too. And I suppose it's like knowing that it's there, giving it a chance to breathe, giving it a chance to express itself. And, you know, when I started off as a barrister, I kind of went through a period where it felt to me like every judge I came across was like something out of a Rumpole sketch from the 70s. You know, they were all these crusty old men, and this is very serious. But then you actually realise that they're not. Now, none of this is to say that the law is essentially pro-worker rather than pro-boss, pro-landlord, pro-tenant rather than pro-landlord. In all sorts of ways, it's institutional biases are there. But at every point, there are people trying to do their best and trying to fight back. And if you give them a chance, then in your case, they might help you to make the difference.
Brilliant. So your book, Against the Law, the full title, which I will get right this time, Why Justice Requires Fewer Laws and a Smaller State, will be absolutely intriguing. And I mean, I guess we just scratched the surface today. I look forward to reading that in full. That's currently out and available, David?
Yeah, you can order it online now. It's not actually going to be published for like another 10 days or so.
But you can pre-order, Yeah,
and it will come pretty soon.
Fantastic. Well, we will share the link to that.
Definitely. And
look forward to, I guess, having you back on again at some point, because I feel like there's so much that we could discuss that we haven't had time to. But thank you so much for joining us.
How about this, When the government has the protest bill, or once by then probably not, once the first time it gets struck out in a court and found to be contrary to basic rights of whatever sort, and get me on for that. How about that?
We'll get you on. You're the VIP for that. So well, thank you again for joining us, and everybody tune in next week for the next episode of Activist Lawyer.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.